Good afternoon and welcome to the last webinar of the LPA of this year. Guess what? It will be on Brexit with a very poetic title. Today we will have this webinar split in two. First, we will have a discussion between Martin Bresson from Invest Europe and Thomas Rubens from DN Capital. And afterwards, we'll have a complete panel discussion with many experts, including also Jessica, who will moderate it from Stepstone Group. Just to set the scene, the Brexit discussions, the transitional period is approaching the end at least, and there are still lots of questions. People are looking for solutions and potentially for new tools or new providers. What can they do? We will try to answer all those different questions. And certainly we should not forget that, for example, the supervisory authorities have also recently released a press release 2026 around Brexit concerning, for example, marketing and passporting, which we would recommend you to have a look at. But just before we start, just wanted to remind you that you can ask questions during those two shows and during then the discussion and the panel via the chat function or the Q&A button. And certainly I will pop up at the end then for also concluding the entire webinar. So let's then directly start with Martin, who is then the Director of Public Affairs for Invest Europe. And he was also worked in the past for a public affairs company. He's really specialized in that and is leading Invest Europe in that direction greatly. We see him a lot, for example, for the policy calls. And he attended, for example, our public roundtable in October. So we have great cooperation as the LPA, since we are the official private equity venture capital association, part of that pan-European network. And we like really to collaborate with them. And then on the other side, we will have Thomas, and he is then a partner of the investment team of DN Capital, a UK VC, specialized. He's specifically focusing then on the e-commerce marketplaces and also software industries. And he had also previous experiences in the investment banking and M&A sector. So gentlemen, I welcome you and let you then start that great discussion. Please share your trends, insights, and we will then gather all the questions before then moving afterwards to the panel.
Right, well, thank you so much, and thank you for the kind words and indeed stressing the good cooperation we have with LPEA. As you know, as mentioned, I'm the Public Affairs Director from Invest Europe, and if I may, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit if I can. Can you see my screen? So I can't see whether you can see it.
Yes, perfectly.
Right. And I just want to outline some of why we care about Brexit. Well, everyone cares about Brexit, so maybe I'm stating the obvious here. But when we look to what we perceive as the European market for private equity and how it's divided between EU 27 and the UK, unfortunately, no longer talking about the EU 28 plus, because we also consider Switzerland part of the package. But of course, there's just, I think there's a whole range of issues and just breaking down the numbers. And I'm not going to go into details on this, but there's just some simple facts is that there's a codependency. We have here, I mean, in front of you, you have some European fundraising over 5 years, well, prior crisis, evidently. So things may have changed very much, but this is how it looks if we look to how the EU versus the UK are sort of investing in each other. Can you still hear me? Because my screen is falling out a little bit. Okay, cool. Thank you, Thomas. And moving on, and I think aside from the codependency between the two entities, EU 27 and UK, there is some simplistic lessons learned, which are, even if they're simple to learn, rather fundamental to the understanding of how the ecosystem between the EU 27 and the UK functions. This slide shows where the investors are located. And I think there's a point to be made about how, actually 12% of where EU funds sourced in the EU are actually invested into the UK. But I think equally interesting is that UK firms fund for money that they pour into investments in the EU 27 on a global stage to an extent where you'd see similarities when we define it as the rest of the world, but actually when it comes to North America and Asia, the money funded in UK firms or flowing into UK firms before they move on to the EU to an extent is a really, really large scale. So London is and will probably remain a hub for international investments, including the investments into EU 27. And that's just here, sort of the last slide of numbers I'm going to show you is just how the investments flow from the, so about, we talked about fundraising. Here's how investments flow from the UK and the EU 27 in various directions. And it's just, but you can just see how big the gray sort of part of the pillar is, and how much of that, in other words, from UK firms have gathered. So over those 5 years, with 94.8 billion that UK firms had fundraised, that was invested into EU 27. It's almost, well, it's almost like 66% of what the EU 27 fund firms had invested into EU 27. So we are talking about a very, very large codependency. And I think the key issue that we have been pursuing from a political or policy perspective from Invest Europe has been talking to either side of the channel on that very issue. Is, I mean, evidently, you know, venture capital might not have been, or private equity has not been on the top of the agenda of issues that needed to be resolved. I think for a long time we were quite conscious of the fact that we may be the last bit of the sausage that needed to be cut out before a deal was made, but at least trying to make sure that both sides understood the codependency and the sort of coherent ecosystem that is not about London providing for the EU or UK providing for the, but actually that either side are dependent on the other. Based on that, and I'll stop, you know, talking about right, so the macroeconomics of things and the macro perspective of things, but based on that common understanding, Invest Europe and our colleagues in the British Venture Capital Association have made a very simple agreed position that we share with politicians on either side and with regulators on either side of the channel. And I don't think it's going to be a massive surprise that it is basically, you know, particularly looking to the future, you know, keep this open and constructive, you know, make sure that the coordinations are as apt and applicable as possible, particularly, I think, focusing on the NPPRs, the national private placements regimes, because we will need them if nothing else is in place. And then encouraging that whatever cliff effects that may come is handled as far as possible by memorandums of understandings and the aforementioned NPPRs. I don't think that Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen is going to say, "Oh, stop the press. These two associations have agreed on something." I think, you know, let's be honest about it. It's hardly that's going to shake the world. But it does matter to us that we can show our members, because we have members on either side of the channel. And of course, for the BVCA, it is important to show to the politicians and the members that, you know, there is a profound care and understanding for how important investments flowing to and from the EU 27 would still be for either side. So on that sort of happy note that we've managed to agree on across the channel, I think we can sort of have hopes for others, maybe more adamant negotiators meeting actually this evening on also making sure that they achieve an agreement. I'm fairly sure it's going to be an agreement if they reach it. That's going to be more than just the two-pager I just introduced you to. This, of course, is the sort of the macro level of codependency. I think when we break it down to something more operational is where the real pain points. I'm not saying we don't feel the pain. We do feel the pain for our members on a daily basis, but I'm assuming, Thomas, that on a daily basis, it's not necessarily the entirety of the ecosystem that bothers you the most.
Absolutely. Oh, thanks, Martin. I think, look, just to to provide a bit more detail on the end first, so I can provide better context on our perspective. Right, we're a venture fund, 600 million euros under assets. We're headquartered in London, but we've got strong operations across Europe and also in the US. I think an interesting aspect of our latest fund is, we've established it in Luxembourg, given some of the uncertainties that we were seeing with the Brexit negotiations. I think what's important for us operating in the technology sector, and to begin with, kind of a very obvious but important high-level statement is, as a European technology investor, we are for kind of regular harmony between European countries and for companies to be able to have access to the best talent, independent of the country of origin, right? And that's all in order to reduce the barriers in building the technology leaders of tomorrow. And we hope as European investors to be able to put Europe in a position to build those global technology leaders. I still believe we're in a strong position to do so, but adding those additional complexities is never a great thing to see. If I have to move into kind of more specific impact as a fund manager, I mean, there's some that you mentioned just now. On the fundraising side, the marketing passport is an important one to raise money from European investors. So we had to go through another way and adapting our to those new regulatory guidelines in order to be able to market our fund to European investors. Then there is a very important component, and I think this probably impacts more the UK, is some of the LP allocations that have specific mandates towards European companies. And obviously with Brexit, UK is no longer part of that mandate. And so it kind of restricts and limits, and we got to, specifically to the end, we've got to be extremely careful in how we allocate the money to make sure that we stay in this mandate. And UK has been an important investment area for us, and obviously this has become more constrained today. And then on the hiring side, as a European fund, we're quite proud of the international DNA within our team, and obviously now with the new regulations in place, it's going to become harder to get access to the best talent across Europe, because there'll be frictions around getting access to visas. And then as importantly, we invest into companies, and so at a portfolio level there are going to be those constraints in terms of hiring. Fortunately, I think startups are more nimble in that sense, where they're gonna, they've adapted to new ways of working already with remote setup, but that will continue to be a friction point. And I think inversely, we're going to see a shift in some of that talent moving into other countries in Europe, whether it's, we're seeing the tech hubs in Paris and Berlin kind of fostering on this international talent coming into the cities right now. So hope that provides some kind of overview of what we're currently seeing as the impact of those regulations coming in.
I mean, Thomas, I think the issues that you flagged are very much the same issues that we, as an association, has sort of received from our members over the last year. I think that the questions on Brexit sort of a big dive in March and April, because there was just, you never thought that anything was going to take attention away from Brexit, but the bigger things happened. But now we're sort of getting back to sort of not a flood of questions, but not quite the flood we had earlier in the year, because I think most people like you guys at the DN has taken steps to mitigate the risk, but we do see, and I think the questions falls in exactly those four categories. It's about fundraising. It's about the operational, and do you need licensing? And are you able to operate and continue your funds or SPVs? And then I think how do you raise funds? But also, as you say, fourth question is the question on talent. And I think for all of those, there are we've tried to do a Q&A for our members, and I think, you know, in the end, let's be honest about it, there are some general answers we can offer, but in effect, every situation is almost unique, and in effect, where we fairly frequently end up by pointing to, please make sure that you contact, you know, your service providing network to get, you know, not just the general answer that we as an association can offer, but actually, you know, a very succinct answer to that particular format that you're in, which I'm sure that participants on the panel after us can elaborate on. But it has definitely increased costs on the lawyer and accountancy side for all of our members, and that as regulatory changes do. So, you know, in a sense, that's just where it is. I think some of the changes that we weren't quite conscious of as to looking to a Brexit context is it's been perceived very much as sort of a binary thing, you know, EU, UK, and there was, I think, a perception that this was continue to be a binary thing. It will still be the EU, UK, but actually, it's the future of this is that it's going to be the EU and the UK as a third country. It's not the sort of the logical tight connection that, you know, that is difficult mentally to break away from is actually what's happening, and I think that rolls into exactly the issue about recruitment. It's like, you know, there are actually very different rules for an EU or an EAA country and a third country as to where your pool of talent can come from. And another example that I don't think we've given so much attention either is the issue of foreign direct investments. Right now, there is not a common EU rule, but there is an increasing trend across EU countries to have their own national foreign direct investment regimes. And actually, that's going to be applicable to EU investments moving forward, because UK is going to be a third country, which is, I think, something that is well, you know, it's not, no one's prohibiting investments, but it's going to lay in a certain layer of administration, of issues to look into, to look at where your portfolio, what are you investing in, and you have, I think, 17 different regimes across Europe. So you will have the pleasure of also just prolonging processes where you are right there in that time frame where you're making the deal. But you don't have 6 additional weeks to wait for the Austrian authorities to approve of you. And I think those are, I think, again, maybe for the panel later on, but those are also considerations that you need to do, is that, you know, it's not just about all of the passporting inside the AFMD regime, or or the MiFID regime if you're a MiFID, but it's actually all the surrounding regulations as well that will impact your status on this side of the channel, which I can say because I'm sitting in Brussels right now.
Absolutely, I think it's also adding to that is the level of certainty on many of those aspects, right? Which makes it difficult to take decisions now, and so you got to take precautions, look at different avenues, which obviously adds cost and around those topics.
And I don't know about your experience. I think when we talk, Invest Europe, we represent LPs and VCs, right? So we have quite a range of members, and clearly taking precautionary measures comes more naturally to some of our members. Pension funds, you know, being risk averse, maybe a little bit bigger part of their DNA than a venture fund in investing in very early seed investments. And for some of our members, I think the whole idea of spending 25 or 30% of their time in a year like the one we've just had, taking precautionary measures just because things make it go wrong it goes counterintuitively to the way they do business, as probably for you guys at DN as well. It's not because you don't want to, but it's just the whole way of thinking that is required is sort of counterintuitive to what you want to do from I was about to say from Monday to Friday, but you know, I'm sure you're busy on Saturdays and Sundays as well.
No, but certainly, I mean, this is a bit of a frustration, but look, it's the work that needs to be done, and it will be done. Our biggest concern is more around, as you mentioned, we operate, for the end in quite early stage companies, so we come in at the Series A, seed stage even sometimes, and the speed of decision needs to be quick. And so how do you make sure that you run the regulatory procedures without hurting your chances of getting access to the most exciting opportunities, because investment opportunities are moving faster and faster. And as we see, there are also a lot more US funds investing into Europe. So we just need to make sure that we continue to be competitive in our ability to maintain speed in making our investment decisions. So that's where we're spending most of our time, to make sure, okay, I mean, the painful aspect, we need to go through it, we'll do it, but just how do we make sure that we continue to operate at the speed that we need to be competitive?
So, well, as I said, your experiences mirrors very much the experiences we have talking to our members. I don't know, should we take questions at this point in time?
Sure, we have received one question, which is, would it be a good idea to do a survey on UK private equity managers to see the percentage of Brexiters and also pro-Europe, in order to know if then where the community stands and which attitude the other players could take concerning that? Would that make sense in your eyes? Or has it been done in the past?
I'd love to hear from you, Thomas, whether you think it's a good idea or not. I think I can answer on behalf of us as an association. We haven't done a survey about, and I don't think we ever would make a survey about our members' political standing. I'm not entirely sure we'd be allowed under GDPR to actually collect their answers to that effect. But if we take the formalities aside, I think from our side, it would probably not be massively relevant. I think about 35% of our members are UK based. But I don't see them being members of, well, they might actually be members of Invest Europe, whether they're Brexiteers or not, but they are members of Invest Europe because they know that the regulation in Europe matters. Of course, they might still hate it, so they might be Brexiteers. I think, what would it actually give us of information? It'll give us an information about what the members care about from a political point of view, but I'm not guiding our members to have a specific political point of view. I'm helping our members in a regulatory environment, making sure that whatever regulation is there on a European level is as benevolent or as little detriment to their business as possible. Whether they then go home and vote for UKIP or Labour or the Tories is actually, I'm not sure I'd be able to use that information. I'd be massively curious to find out what our members are thinking about the issues that I care about, but as an association, I don't think we'll gain much from knowing this.
And Thomas, would you like to add something?
I think
it would make a question.
I would agree with Martin on this one. I think it would make for a good dinner discussion, but not sure it would, it would help much more than that.
Great. And another question would be also for you, Thomas. You were discussing on how to mitigate risk, how to continue business as efficiently as possible. Could you share a little bit what you have done personally and what you could do and recommend to other players?
Well, I think it's as you set up fund in a new administration, you need to understand the process of what will need to happen in order for a deal to go through. And so we're just being, we've just managed our investment process in a way that now we have all the information ready and in a complete manner, so that we can prepare as we're finalizing the deal with the company, then in parallel, all the investment process is being done as efficiently as possible, and that there's no delay in our decision making because of that. So it's just adding a bit earlier in our process, kind of a parallel work stream in preparing the right set of information in order to keep and maintain the speed in winning the opportunities that we want to invest into.
Thank you, Thomas. And then a last quick question for both of you. Have you seen a strong demand from European LPs and asking then the UK GPs to move away from the English or Scottish LPs, limited partnerships, or Cayman funds into more European AIFs? Any trends there?
No, I haven't. We haven't seen that trend from, but and I'm not sure we ever will. I think in many respects, there is a part of that that's about the money, and then there's a part of it that's about, you know, the GP LP relation, which is carried on competences, you know, portfolio relationships, and a number of other things. I think to the last end of your question, maybe there may be a considered point about some of the LPs, and maybe I'm overly biased here because I'm Scandinavian, will look very much to the reputation, not just of what is invested for them, but also who are they invested jointly with. And there might be issues emerging around tax havens and others. So there might be sort of emerging issues here, but I haven't seen that as a big trend. I think also, you know, everything for 2020, any trend you take away that is not related to managing the challenges that this year has given all of our companies, including the challenge of pivoting in making tactical choices and strategical choices with the portfolio companies. I think I'd take everything other than those trends with a little bit of a little grain of salt.
I think no direct ask in that, in the way you phrase it, but I think what we're seeing though is more questions from LPs, you know, that are more specific to certain regions of whether or not you're a European fund or your UK fund, in terms of the portfolio companies that you invest, and depending on the level of priorities and your current fund exposure, then the discussions were, you know, whereas before it was seen as one European part. You know, it's for a limited portion of LPs, but you know, we've had some of those discussions where we could clearly see that defining where we stood and kind of where we're invested had a strong importance.
Great, thanks a lot, gentlemen, for your insights and for sharing your views with our audience today. We will see you soon again, and now we will pass over to the second part of our webinar, which is the panel. I will then introduce you now to Jessica Ott. She is director at Stepstone Group, a global private markets investment firm investing into, or managing rather, the primary, secondary, and also funds and co-investments, and which are across the PE, RE, real assets, infrastructure, and debt sectors. So Jessica, the mic is yours now, and please introduce us then to your great panel in order to discuss then the more operational, legal, marketing, and passporting items.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel today. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our panel, I would like to encourage you all to please ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We would very much like this session, as much as we are in a virtual world, to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask away, and I'll try and bring those in as we go through our questions during this panel session. My panel, I'm delighted today again to be joined by the following, and perhaps the relevant speaker can put their hand up when I introduce them so everyone knows who they are. I'm going to start with Emma Danforth. Emma is a senior associate at Allen & Overy and is a member of their funds and asset management group. She's based in London. I then have Matthew Goldblatt, who's the head of alternative investment services at JP Morgan, and he's responsible for the private equity, real estate, and hedge fund service businesses. He is also the global product manager for alternative asset portfolio administration on behalf of their institutional investors, and he is based in Luxembourg. Next, we have got Sarah Shackleton, who's a partner at Development Partners International, a private equity firm which invests across Africa, and she's based in London. And finally, last but by no means least, we're joined by Martin Vogel, who is the CEO of Europe for DMS Governance. DMS Governance is a global fund governance firm, and he too is based in Luxembourg. So to start this panel, we thought we would just kick things off really by looking at sort of the Brexit, the state of play, and what the environment's going to look like in this new post-Brexit world. And to get all our panelists speaking, I'm going to ask to, straight off the bat today, as of today, what is the impact of Brexit on your respective firms and on your respective products? And perhaps I'll start with Emma, if you could give an overview, and I'll just go through the panelists as I introduce them.
Of course. So based in London, we advise an awful lot of UK managers on their fund operations. And I think I'd say my clients kind of fall into 3 buckets. You've got those who kind of already had some form of EU presence. So for them, I think Brexit hasn't had a huge impact. They might be having a reshuffle as they move a few more operations across to Europe, but otherwise, it's worked quite well for them. We've then got a middle group who have set up a new EU presence, and I think Brexit's certainly been a lot more disruptive for them. It's been that big operational piece about how do your UK team continue to work, what's your new EU team doing, and actually what does that EU entity look like? I think the third group we've got is clients who think that in the short term, at least, they're going to take a bit of a wait and see approach. So they're not setting up an EU entity, they don't have a presence over there already, and they're going to kind of limit, I suppose, their operations to what they can do in that kind of grey area of things that are outside the scope of regulation while they wait it out and see what the future regulatory picture is going to look like.
Thank you. Matthew, how are things looking from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd say from a JP Morgan asset servicing perspective, we would only see clients in Emma's bucket 1 and bucket 2. Bucket 3 wouldn't be with us just yet, but within those buckets, I think the trend that I've very much seen is managers that are looking at Luxembourg as a domicile for the first time, with that implicit education, and we're talking smart and large, potentially significant names who really haven't looked at or needed Luxembourg within the fund's portfolio for the preceding years. So education on the role of the AFM, or education on the role of depository, that is a unique component for Luxembourg funds, helping clients understand the regulatory framework. So it's very much an informal education with clients, and very much having a pipeline of clients that are looking at Luxembourg really for the first time.
And Sarah, from a GP perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So DPI is an African private equity firm, and we invest across Africa. Our funds are based in the Channel Islands and Mauritius, obviously with GPs in those jurisdictions. So, so far we've always marketed into the EU through national private placement, because both the funds and the GPs are third country. So as a result, we're probably less impacted by Brexit in terms of, how we market funds and set up funds, compared to a lot of other GPs. So for us, I think, recruiting staff out of the EU is a big factor that we're thinking about. We do get staff out of there. That's going to have an impact. And also, I think potentially we may see a lot more questioning around, the jurisdiction of your funds, particularly if we see a disconnect between the regulation in the UK and the EU. I think we may see a lot more questions from LPs in the future.
Thank you. And finally, Martin, how does it impact in your business?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, and a warm welcome to everybody. I mean, DMS, as being one of the largest third-party management company and governance provider in Luxembourg Island, also in London, I mean, we probably profit from the Brexit discussion as a business. I mean, we can offer, and we have already done so in the past months, we can offer clients local solutions as management companies or IFMs. We can help clients on the distribution side, a topic we will touch in a second. We can help a lot in different areas, the UK asset managers or the UK distributors, how to access the EU market in the future. So for us, on a purely egoistic point of view, it's actually an interesting topic. What we have also done, we also have built up a London-based ACD, a Manco-like solution there. So for the clients that actually believe tomorrow they need a local UK solution, that's also something that we can offer out of our group.
So there's clearly, depending on where one is sitting, there are different impacts of Brexit.
Indeed.
I suppose if we focus a bit more on the UK fund initiators, what solutions do we have available? What solutions are available for those who do not yet have an established presence in the European Union? And actually, Emma, I thought I might start with you. Perhaps you can just give an overview as to what the new environment, so we can get sort of a bit of the bigger picture, what the new environment's going to look like for UK fund initiators. And then Martin, perhaps I'll revert back to you to provide an overview of those solutions that you touched on just now.
Certainly. So thinking about this, of course, in the kind of distribution perspective. So from the 1st of January, any UK managers currently relying upon AFMD passports to market funds in the EU won't be able to do so anymore. The good thing about it, I mean, talk about AIFs here and the AFMD regime. The good thing is that that already envisages a third country manager regime. And so there is already a framework for how a non-EU manager, which is what a UK fund initiator would be after the 1st of January, how they would market. And the way it does that is through the Article 42 regime. And that gives each member state the option to have a national private placement regime to enable non-EU managers to market funds in their jurisdiction. I think the key bit just to focus on, though, is it kind of piggybacks off the underlying national private placement regime in each jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions have just basically copy and pasted Article 42, so it's effectively just the requirements of the directive. But other jurisdictions have got additional requirements on top. And so it's going to be that mapping exercise of thinking, what does a national private placement regime look like in each jurisdiction? And I think a key point to consider is for the entity that's actually doing any marketing is thinking, are there any requirements in relation to regulatory authorizations, for example, that that actual entity needs to comply with itself? Does the Article 42 regime all the requirements, or does the entity itself need to have some regulatory authorization? And that's particularly relevant if you're looking at having delegation of distribution to a third party.
So how can that be resolved in practice, perhaps? Martin, what solutions are available, particularly for those who don't have an EU presence yet?
Maybe I want to start a little bit from the bigger picture. I mean, I think today you have UK asset managers managing portfolios for funds that are domiciled within the EU member states. And I think there, as probably all of you know, the good news is they can continue to do that even after the Brexit regime. So the fact that you can actually manage an EU domiciled fund out of the UK, I think there is a common understanding that this continues to be possible since the UK is considered as an adequate jurisdiction compared to the different EU domiciles. So that's an easy part to solve. And I think that's also a little bit what Martin Bresson said in the beginning. It's not that the whole asset management industry actually moves away, by no means. Then, of course, you have a second aspect. You had mainly UK-based AFMs, alternative investment fund management companies. They passported their license into the 27 EU member states. Very often it was Luxembourg or Italy or Ireland or Spain. That is not possible anymore as of the end of this year. Of course, most of the players already found a solution, but you always have the odd exception. I mean, we have a couple of clients, they are just trying now to get the solution until December 31st. And that probably is rather tight on the timeline. But that model, passporting your Manco license out of the UK into the EU, that is something that will stop. And again, if you have not already a solution in place, then you need one. The two solutions are basically simple. You either have or will establish your own Manco AFM, or you appoint a third-party one. And there are plenty of competitors out there who can offer these services. Some are specialized for certain asset classes, as are big enough to do everything. So that's the two solution. And then, of course, you have the distribution aspect, what Emma talked about. That's also I mean, many of the, probably not only the UK players, but also the US and the Asian players, they use London as their distribution hub to then move into the EU member states. And that is also something, of course, that is very limited moving forward. There are discussions around what solutions could be there. You have solutions, you probably heard all these terms. You have secondments, you have dual employment agreements, you have tied agent models. You have different possibilities. All of them, and we may go into detail afterwards, but all of them have a lot of restrictions, a lot of hurdles to actually meet, a lot of local conditions from the regulators. So ultimately, there probably are very few solutions which are really valid if you want to do a full marketing exercise. Emma.
And I think I'd just add to that. So we had quite a few clients who were looking at the kind of secondment dual hatting solution, particularly to marketing. And I think for those clients, the recent kind of ESMA discussions and then the CSSF release from earlier this week, I think it's becoming clearer that I don't think secondment and dual hatting is perhaps as good a solution as it was originally thought to be. For those who haven't had a chance to look at the press release, I think that's the CSSF saying that if you want to do a secondment, it's expecting that person to be based predominantly in Luxembourg, which challenges quite a few models that clients had originally wanted to do, where you had people based in the UK effectively saying they were acting on behalf of a Luxembourg entity when they wanted to do certain activities. And I think when we've been talking to clients, I think like Martin said, it's too late for them to set up an entity. So they've been looking at, can they borrow an entity from someone else? So looking at kind of a tied agent solution. And for those that can't, I think it ends up coming down to what can you do within the context of pre-marketing or any exemptions to performing effectively a regulated activity in jurisdictions, which ultimately, isn't a great solution. As we'll come on to later in the talk, I think the ability to rely on that kind of mishmash is somewhat affected by the new cross-border distribution of funds directive and regulation.
I mean, I may add a little bit of flavor on the secondment solution, at least from a Luxembourg point of view. I wouldn't know about other domiciles, but I think they have all the thoughts in the same direction. What the Luxembourg authority clearly says is they do not want to have a UK individual having a secondment agreement with a Luxembourg MiFID or Manco company and simply traveling into Germany, Spain, and France, and then going back home. And for these traveling days, they use then their secondment agreement to do business. That is not the way it will be accepted and handled. If you spend 20–30% of your distribution time in Luxembourg, and then of course you have to travel, and you can show that you actually do the follow-up calls, you do the minute writing, you do all of these related activities, not out of the UK, but actually in Luxembourg, then the CSSF may consider that such a secondment could be a possible solution. But again, all I'm saying here, and I think that's important if somebody thinks about such a solution, it needs to be pre-approved by the regulator. It needs to have a certain logic that if you sit in the UK, you don't respond to calls from your distribution partner or your prospects. You do that out of your secondment domicile. You have to spend time there. You have to be supervised. You have to follow certain hierarchic reporting lines. So it is a model that may work, but there is a lot, and I think the Irish colleagues and others go actually in the same direction. It's quite demanding to fulfill the respective requirements.
And if we're saying that there are all these solutions available, and you're, let's say, still a UK fund initiator, you don't have a solution yet in the European Union, or one of the ones that we've discussed. You did touch on the marketing component of it, and I kind of want to focus a little bit more on that, because there are these national private placements regime, the NPPR, which is a way in which a non-EU company or firm or GP can market their funds into the EU. And Sarah, obviously, I know that you're London-based, but you have got experience, I believe, in that particular one. And perhaps you can just give us a little bit of background on that and how you have seen that work in practice.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, it is an option, and it's worked well for us. You know, we market globally, so the EU is not our only jurisdiction where LPs come from. We also quite a niche product. So again, we're targeting quite specific LPs rather than a very broad-based approach where, you know, we're sort of going out to every you know, LP in the market and in Europe. So it has worked well for us. What I think is challenging is it certainly requires, you know, finding out the rules in every single jurisdiction you want to go to. So, you know, you do have to get advice on that. It is different in every jurisdiction. It does require, you know, some places are quite simple. It's just a simple notification to the regulator, and then annual reporting or semi-annual, depending on size of the fund. In other jurisdictions, it requires, you know, a lot of documentation, sometimes in local languages, needs pre-approval before you can actually start marketing. So it's really, you know, you have to do quite a lot of work and a lot of planning to make sure you're complying with every single regime's rules. And it's also not available in every country. So, you know, some of the bigger markets like France, Italy, Spain, it's not possible to use that approach. You know, some GPs have looked at reverse solicitation. I think that is possible on a sort of an ad hoc, you know, just a couple of LPs. It's not something you could use as a strategy. So it's definitely an option. It just isn't consistent across the whole of Europe.
So it's a bit more complicated than perhaps just a one-fit-all solution. So bearing that in mind, bearing in fact, you know, Martin, you touched on there's going to be certain bureaucratic hurdles to jump through, there's sort of layers of complication. If we take a step back, and perhaps Matthew, I'll start with you on this. What do we really think, or perhaps the better question is, do we think that there is going to be a change in the flow of capital to UK-based funds versus AIFMD compliant funds going forward? I mean, what do we think the impact is actually going to be in terms of capital flow?
So I think it's a great question, Jessica, and it sounds a very forward-looking question. You know, I think my observation working with global LPs very much the last 5 years or so has been an increased flow of capital into the AIFM funds, into Luxembourg. I think that the ability for, you know, an LP, chicken and egg, meaning is the LP themselves driving that conversation? Are they the ones choosing to not go into a UK fund? Or is it really just the funds themselves have chosen to step out of the UK and launch themselves, like I mentioned before, here in Luxembourg? So, you know, very much, I think the LP numbers that I've seen point to almost a double-digit increase in number of funds that a number of commitments they've made, as well as number of assets that they've committed to Luxembourg. That's looking back sort of over 15, 16 versus call it now 19, 20. So from my perspective, there's been a shift, but I think that shift is directly in line with there being more funds in the market. As we all know the stats in terms of the Luxembourg funds that have launched over the last 7 or 8 years, there's been that similar, call it linear increase to current. So I think LPs, chicken and egg, like I said, are LPs driving that conversation? Are they just following the GPs? I would tend to fall into the latter, meaning the GPs are looking for good investment opportunities, they're looking at the strategy of the GP, and whether that happens to be the Lux fund versus the UK fund, the LP tends to follow suit.
Which, Sarah, perhaps leads me straight to you from a GP perspective. Do you see a change?
Not seeing a change yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more questions coming out of LPs in the future about where your funds are, what the differences might be, whether they, you know, there's particularly if there's a divergence in how, you know, UK managers and advisors are regulated versus EU. I don't think there's going to be a significant difference in the short term, but I think we may see a lot more of that coming in the future. You know, we've already seen a lot coming out of LPs over the last couple of years around substance in the jurisdictions where you have your funds. Also looking at, you know, different jurisdictions that may be thought of more, you know, as tax havens, etc. I think there's a lot of questioning around that, and I expect we're going to see, you know, a similar line of questioning around, you know, how UK managers are differing from their EU counterparts.
You touched on a very important point there, actually, I think substance. And so I'm perhaps going to focus on that a little bit. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about the capital flow, but obviously there is this element of substance, and that involves human capital movement. So I really do want to focus on that a little bit. And I know that Luxembourg in particular has got certain domiciliation requirements regarding substance. Current ones, they're also looking to change that. Emma, could you give us an overview of what those requirements are and what the expected substance requirements are going forward, and what that might have as an impact for UK-based fund initiators?
Of course, and I think, you know, they need to be a surprising topic to anyone in this room, because obviously I think substance has been a key word in the lips for quite a while. You know, even back when AFMD came in 2014, the whole concept of a letterbox entity, you need to have real substance in your AFIM. It's nothing really new, and I think it's come to light because when everyone was trying to set up their new entities in Europe or utilize existing ones, I think the EU's been very clear that you can't just be, you know, one person sat in a room with a pen and paper and everything really happening back in the UK. For most of our clients that have been setting up in Luxembourg, I think they've been expected to have 3 full-time equivalent employees based in that office. So I think objectively, most of us would say that's still quite a skinny operation. I think in practice, most of our clients end up having something a bit beefier around that. But they are, you know, I think it's fair to say it's still quite small, and there is ultimately, from a management's perspective, quite often all your portfolio management delegated back to the UK, and quite often you still want to have some distribution and other services delegated back to the UK. I think the CSF press release we talked about earlier, you know, is a first, and I think what will be a chain of steps, just trying to tighten up that substance requirement. So, you know, it's been saying people who are working and seconded into your entity, you know, need to be spending, you know, a fair proportion of their time based in Luxembourg. And I think, like you've probably seen in the press in relation to management, you know, the requirements for delegation are slowly getting tighter and tighter. And I think it's all going to comes down from the fact that EU's ultimate view is that if you are advising EU investors, you really ought to be doing that from within the EU. So I think while in the short term, you know, you can get away with, you know, reasonably minimal substance requirements, I think in the medium to long term, that is going to be something that gets heavier and heavier.
And Martin, from a Luxembourg perspective, based in Luxembourg, how do you think that will play out? And what does beefier and heavier actually mean in practice?
Look, I mean, I think, again, Emma rightly pointed out that's a hot topic and has been for a while. I think, again, important to understand is, I mean, that the main driver is not only Luxembourg or any other country, it's actually the European Security Market Regulator, it's ESMA. Again, the goal, there was already before Brexit, the goal is actually, and again, it depends a little bit whether we talk about the management company IFM or whether we have a MiFID firm or a portfolio management license. But ultimately, the goal is, if you do execute a licensed activity, then you need to have the means, the resources, the IT infrastructure, the know-how, the personnel to actually execute them. And when you look, if I take the example of an IFM, probably the most relevant one, even if you delegate portfolio management, you need to supervise your depository, your administrator, your portfolio manager. You need to do your compliance. You need to understand the investments that the portfolio manager is actually doing. You have your reporting duties. You have a lot on the table. And of course, in the old days, you probably could start with 1-2 persons and then grow. Today, of course, if you're not just a single fund-related company, you probably go more in the direction of 4, 5, 6 people, and then together with systems and premises and external, internal audit, that easily costs you 1.5 to 2 million euros. I think that, you know, if you want to do it right, and there's a second component, you should not only do it right because the regulator tells you so. Ultimately, it's also in the benefit of the end investor to have an assurance that things are actually done well and controlled. So you have these two levels that you take into consideration. But I think the point here is, before you start doing it on your own, whether it's a MiFID license or a ManCo license, you really have to look well into the cost involved, and then again to decide, is it better to do it myself, or do I actually go to a professional that can help me do that and leverage on what they do already for many others.
And if we're looking at these sort of the professional, the third-party services, and I'm looping it back a little bit to what we discussed at the start of this panel, which when we looked at the various solutions available for UK fund initiators. So if I'm focusing on them a little bit, and we are focusing a bit more on the marketing solutions available to them. And Martin, perhaps you can just continue with that and say, and give an overview as to what marketing support solutions are available. You've already touched on them, perhaps go in a little bit more detail, but more importantly, how is Luxembourg set up for that, and how is Luxembourg preparing to kind of service perhaps UK fund initiators that are looking to come to leverage these third-party service providers that you mentioned?
I don't think that's actually a specific Luxembourg discussion or not. I think that's a generic discussion. Again, the best solution is for a UK asset manager to establish a MiFID firm with a distribution license within an EU member state, and that basically allows them, the people, then to go out and market the funds based on the MiFID distribution rules. That has a cost factor. That means people need to, of course, to be employed locally. So if you don't want to go that route, or if you don't want yet to go that route, then one model, for example, is, of course, you can appoint another MiFID firm to partially do the distribution, or at least the initial distribution yourself. They then introduce the portfolio manager for follow-up calls. But then, of course, you would need to get a MiFID firm that is offering these services. That can be a solution. That's something that we partially do in the group for selected clients. Again, another opportunity is that you could have the distribution person in London engage in a dual employment agreement with a licensed entity in Dublin, France, Luxembourg, wherever. That's where I come all the requirements I said before. You can do the same with a contractual relationship, a secondment. Again, with all the number of restrictions I mentioned before, or you rely on the national private placement regimes, as we have discussed before, with all the uncertainty. What can I do in which country? And that is quite tedious to find out, and you run the risk to actually get it wrong.
And Matthew, from a, I'm sorry, I thought I froze for a second. You were all so still. Matthew, from your client perspective, so you've got obviously international clients in Luxembourg. What are you seeing in terms of how they might be using different ways of distributing and marketing from the UK into Europe? Are you seeing any particular trends at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a unique time to sort of find the funds that are midway through their fundraising stage and their closes. If you find the funds that sort of will be bridging over the year end, I think an aspect that I've seen is clients that are effectively going to stop the marketing but still be open for investor closing, which is fine. So that means the next 2 weeks are going to be very busy, and then they can still accept investors post January. But I think a lot of other funds have really put a pause, if you will, on that fundraising to really focus on a new plan come the new year.
Interesting. And Sarah, perhaps just from the GP perspective, are you seeing what Matthew's seeing? What is your view from London?
Yeah, you know, haven't really seen a huge change. Again, because we're already using NPPR, we haven't been, you know, we haven't had to think about a different solution. So I suppose we're in a slightly different category there. Obviously, we work a lot with Luxembourg and, you know, have seen a real increase in the amount of, you know, funds and managers using Luxembourg as a jurisdiction over the last several years. And I think, you know, the factor that I think really will play out over the next couple of years is just whether there's a significant increase coming into places like Luxembourg and whether they're set up to cope with all of that extra business. I know that they've been, you know, working hard and you know, really marketing themselves as a jurisdiction. But you know, we'll just have to see exactly how that plays out as well.
I think that's exactly it, so how it all plays out, and it's all going to have to play out quite quickly because we're coming up to the end of the year. And so perhaps, I know that we again touched on it slightly at the beginning, but for those rates managed by UK AIFMs, the question really is, are they going to be able to finalise their migration to an EU AIFM by year end if they wanted to? Perhaps, I mean, there must be some nuance in that. Perhaps, Emma, you can just give an overview of the migration process. And then we can maybe see whether it's still possible for certain funds to actually set themselves up by year end. I'm presuming that's a yes or a no answer, but be interested to get your feedback.
I think it's helpful just to think of it as two separate buckets. So Luxembourg has said that Luxembourg race need to be managed by Luxembourg AIFM by the 31st of December 2020, but that's kind of in parallel to non-RAFE structures where there might also be a change for Brexit, where you're trying to change who your manager is. I think for most of the RAFEs we have doing this process, you know, it's been completed or will be done by the end of the year. I think that's because a RAFE is unregulated, well, very, very lightly regulated, I suppose. So it's just a mere notification procedure to the CSSF that you're changing your AIFM and any investor consents if you require them. That seems to be quite a straightforward process. I think it's a bit more complicated for some of the Brexit restructurings, where if, for example, you're a CIF, you also need to go and get the CSSF's approval. And I think that's where I've seen perhaps some of the delays, perhaps as well because some of those documents are slightly older. And so when you're trying to get your investor consents, it's become a bit of a trade-off because people want to trade new points as part of that approval. So I think those are just doing the race, just doing the AIFM swap has, you know, been relatively straightforward. It's where there's a bit of Brexit planning or restructuring that I've seen more complications.
And I mean, do we think that, so let's say if UK fund initiators have started that process already, and let's say it doesn't, you know, they're halfway there, if you will, is that deadline going to be fixed by year end, or do we think that there's going to be a bit of give and take?
I think it's at discretion of the CSSF, you know, and I think where people have done everything they can to get somewhere. I think obviously, you know, the CSSF's known for being, you know, flexible and pragmatic. I think if someone's been sat there and hasn't taken steps, I think it's unlikely the CSSF are going to be feeling sympathetic.
Yeah, and then they can rely on some of the other solutions.
Maybe on that note, I mean, again, legally speaking, right now, if you have not appointed a AIFM, at least now speaking about Luxembourg again, your fund as of January 1st will be without an AIFM. That means you fall out of the AIFMD directive. That means you're not qualified, and that would actually trigger the need for liquidating the fund. So we discussed that actually today, at least in-house with some lawyers. You know, if you have advised the regulator that you are in the process of appointing somebody, but because of whatever legal or other activities, you may not meet the deadline end of the year, you know, what happens then? And again, I think right now you can only hope that the regulator will apply a certain discretionary time frame. I guess you still have to think there are investors behind who have nothing done wrong. So I would assume they will. but I don't think there is any confirmation right now. So if you are late, you run the risk. And again, this is not only true for Luxembourg. This is true if you have passported your UK Manco into Italy or Spain, you run the risk that you have to liquidate the fund.
I think it's fair to say, though, most people who are going to do Brexit planning did it, and had it done, particularly given we had the earlier March deadline, sorry, February deadline that then got pushed back. And I think a lot of people who didn't do anything by then were just taking the wait and see approach and not going to do anything. So I think you're talking about a very, small number of people who had left it late, who are looking like they're going to be held up by any kind of delays in getting things through.
If we're talking about preparation, I'm going to do a slight pivot. I know we are sort of running out of time, but I think it's quite important to touch on that, considering we're talking about marketing and distribution. In terms of preparing ourselves, or everyone preparing themselves, what do we think is the main impact of this new EU directive and regulation on the cross-border distribution of funds going to be? It comes fully into force from August of next year. And it would be very interesting to get your views quickly, because again, with time, on how this might affect private equity fund initiators, including those in the UK, although they will be obviously outside of the EU by then. But to start, perhaps Emma, staying with you, could you just provide a brief summary of the directive and what it's going to mean?
Yes, and apologies for people who's 6 o'clock in their jurisdiction going into regulation at this time. I'm sure most of you have kind of heard of this new cross-border fund distribution directive and regulation. Quite useful to spend a moment thinking about the background. So when AIFMD came in, the purpose was to harmonise across the entire EU. And I think one of the problems that's been found is that the way different member states have implemented the AIFMD, there's been certain divergences. And the purpose of this directive is to try and iron those out. The most key area that's really looking at is the concept of pre-marketing under the AIFMD. As I'm sure most of you are aware, under AIFMD, you have the concept of AIFMD marketing, which triggers certain notifications that need to be made to the regulators. And you have a concept of pre-marketing, which isn't quite enough to trigger that AIFMD marketing. And so there's been the exercise of going through different jurisdictions to work out, am I pre-marketing or am I AIFMD marketing? And pre-marketing is very useful because it gives you the ability to test the water with investors without needing to do your notifications. There's been the new directive tries to set out a definition of what pre-marketing is and what documentation can and can't be given as part of pre-marketing. I think this is to be welcomed in some respects, because at the moment, some jurisdictions don't really have a concept of pre-marketing or have a very narrow one. So that's very helpful for fund managers because it's clarifying what does count as your pre-marketing. The downside is that they've added on a notification process. So within 2 weeks of starting pre-marketing, you have to notify the regulator that you're doing pre-marketing. And I think a lot of people view that as an unnecessary additional administration point. I think what's interesting is that it's going to move, in my view, the discussion between what is marketing, what is pre-marketing, down the line to a discussion between what is pre-marketing and what is, I suppose, pre-marketing. So query if that's how useful that's going to be. One kind of key point that's worth taking away is that as drafted, the directive provides that if you are in pre-marketing, that pre-marketing can only be provided by an EU authorised entity. And there's been quite a few people who've been raising questions about that, but there hasn't been any further guidance on that. So if, for example, you have a structure whereby you've delegated marketing back to the UK, theoretically that UK entity would no longer be able to perform that marketing. And so that's certainly a development to be aware of. The actual pre-marketing requirements are only stated to apply to an EU AIFM marketing an EU AIF. But there's then quite an odd reference saying that non-EU AIFMs can't be treated more favourably than EU AIFMs. And so there's a question out there saying, well, to maintain that level playing field, are you going to have to apply this pre-marketing regime to your Article 36, Article 42 regimes to keep that level playing field. And I think ultimately we'll have to wait until we see the legislation implementing this in each member state to find out. My colleagues at Airsphere have been surveying this, and they haven't yet, I believe, had any jurisdictions come back saying what their local legislation is going to say on this point. A couple of other things just to flag. So reverse solicitations is quite a hot topic at the moment, with some people using it to supplement their Brexit planning. And the legislation provides that if you've made a pre-marketing notification, any subscription by a professional investor within 18 months of that notification will be counted as being active marketing. And again, this is where the legislation perhaps isn't as clear as it could be, because it's not clear whether you're talking about any investors that you have approached using that pre-marketing in a particular jurisdiction, or any investor in a jurisdiction, or in fact, any investor in the EU. And so the scope of that restriction, I think, is an area to follow. And then finally, there's also a mechanism to de-notify registrations where you've made one. So this has been something that funds have tried to do historically. If you've notified in one country, to de-notify, not every jurisdiction has permitted that. One thing to be aware of is you can only de-notify if you satisfy certain conditions. And in relation to open-ended funds, a key one is you've got to make an offer to repurchase all of the shares or units. There's also a little nasty bite where it says that if a de-notification is made, the manager is prohibited from marketing that AIF or any AIF with a similar investment strategy for 36 months. And so I think a lot of people won't be using this de-notification process, because that's effectively a 3-year ban on setting up a new fund or reopening investments for that fund. So they're probably the kind of biggest changes. And as Jessica said, I think you're looking at August 2021 for when these start to bite.
Matthew, how are you seeing clients start to prepare for this on your side? Is this something that's being factored in?
I think where we see the biggest potential impact, ironically, is, up until now, I think the GPs have sort of led a lot of the readiness for Brexit, for funds, for structure. And I think if you look to the LP with Emma's second to last point around the solicitation and the pre-marketing, where there is sort of an impact on when was the LP engaged, how were they engaged, I think now the LPs will need to be paying a bit more attention. I think that will be something that's going to be added to their due diligence, something that's going to be added to their sort of overall governance of fund selection. And I think that's where we will see a pretty big impact.
Interesting. And Sarah, will this impact you based in London? How are you thinking about it?
I think it's just going to be, you're going to need to do a lot of more research on this particular point and, factor it into your whole marketing strategy. So I think it's just yet another thing that you have to consider. I think, people that do use reverse solicitation are going to have to think really carefully about, how this impacts, and, you're just going to have to be much more organized in, what's pre-marketing, what's marketing, when all these different notifications need to be made, and just makes it much more complex. It's not making it easier to market across, the jurisdiction.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panel. I think we've just hit the time. So I don't know if Louis wants to, if I want to hand back to you, or if there are any questions from the audience, please do add. We had one, which I think we answered. It was, to read it specifically, it says that, we understand the AIF and Brexit issue for managing a EU fund for a UK GP, but then the question was, what about placement and fundraising? If you have a member of your IR team in the EU or use different partners than you have done in the past. And I think we touched on that when we talked about the different solutions and ways in which you can now market going forward. Perhaps there's a question about the reverse. I don't know about EU funds distributing into the UK, but that's probably for another topic altogether. Louis, I pass over to you. Thank you to all my panelists.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. Really great panel, very instructive, and I'm persuaded that most of our attendees will take good illustrations and examples out of it. Also, thanks to our two gentlemen of the first discussion. Would also like to thank you, the audience, then for attending this webinar. It will be recorded. I mean, it was recorded. It will be posted very soon after the classical edit. You saw me in the beginning with my E-Insights card. That is our flagship conference, which we held digitally on the 25th of November. The videos will soon be available. And there we also had a quick Brexit panel with BVCA, etc. So, I mean, that you could also link to that discussion to make it more complete. Again, very quickly, thanks a lot for attending the LPA webinars. I just wanted to show you the last interview series we will have. This is with our president of the association, Klaus Mansfeld. And we will then start also a new GP-LP series during the second part of that interview. So also big thanks to Michaela from the LPA team for the global events, and also certainly to our two special advisors, Valentine and also Enrico, for their help. Thanks a lot to all of you, and see you very soon, and stay safe.